Our speaker tonight is Mr. Thomas Zung. Mr. Zung is an architect from Cleveland, Ohio. He's been practicing there for about a year. He was educated at Drew University, Virginia Polytechnic Institute, Columbia University, and the University of Michigan. He's licensed to practice in many states. He has served in the United States Army and the Signal Corps with duty in Korea. His travel has included the Far East and Europe and Mexico and the Caribbean. His professional experience has included Coffin and Coffin and Francis Kiley in New York City, and worked with Edward Urell Stone for about 8 years. In fact, it was Mr. Stone, when he was here last year, who put us in contact with Mr. Zung. He said that if we were looking for a guest lecturer, he'd be a good man to have. He did many special projects for Edward Urell Stone, including the United States Naval Academy. He has been a design consultant for a firm in Memphis, Tennessee, and he's currently self-employed. His drawings have been exhibited. Drawings of the John F. Kennedy Cultural Center in Washington, D.C. were shown at the National Gallery of Art and also at the Smithsonian Institute. His drawings for the Naval Academy were shown at the Architectural League in New York City. And his drawings and work on the State University of New York at Albany, New York, the new campus there by Stone, were shown at the New York State Capitol. He has been a consultant to the government of Spain, doing work in Madrid, Spain, and also the Plaza de España for the city of New Orleans International Trademark Complex. He's done work, consultant work in Rome, Italy, and also for the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. He is speaking tonight on the pyramids of Egypt and the pyramids of Mexico. Mr. Zung.
Thank you very much, Dean, and it gives me a great pleasure to be here tonight, not only because you're starting off in the new venture in the new School of Architecture, but I think we as architects, and I certainly include everybody in this room who is interested, we have to realize that architecture as we know it today, 20th century architecture, started in the Midwest. So don't ever be ashamed that, oh, I'm from the Midwest, and I'm the first to admit it, having been raised in New York City from the age of 4.5 to the age of 34. And I say this with a great deal of proudness now, because I have moved to Cleveland, Ohio, because when we think of Sullivan starting the great School of Architecture here, the three greatest architects of our century certainly have been Frank Lloyd Wright, Mies van der Rohe, and Le Corbusier. And we know that Mr. Wright started out in the hills of Wisconsin. Mies van der Rohe came from Germany here to Chicago area and has produced the steel and glass and the architecture as we know it in the international style. Corbusier got as far as New York City, got sick, and then went back. And I think probably it's the attitude and mentality of the Midwest that has allowed this to happen. And we're thinking of the real giants of architecture when we speak about the Midwestern mind. So don't be fooled about smart aleck New Yorkers like myself who think we know all the answers. If we did, we wouldn't be here today, and I'm very pleased to be here today indeed. I think probably the other thing that we have to think about in terms of looking at any architecture is the concept that goes behind it. And this goes together much more than the functional or the flow patterns or the diagrams that we now have up on the boards. It goes to something that is within ourselves that we look at, that the architect goes through this whole synthesis of process. So we're looking today at the pyramids of Mexico and of Egypt, not only from the historical point of view, but much more conceptually. And so if I skim over some of the areas which are historical, which are included, but not as much as perhaps you might like to, I'm sure that your own historian at school can teach you a lot more about that than I can. And with that in mind, bear with these slides, because we are thinking in terms of concept, why they are, and what we can look for when we see a piece of architecture of some merit or what makes it so. Now, I believe that we are too young a nation to die by degeneration, yet too vigorous to die violently. But if for some catastrophic reason 20th century man were to annihilate our present Western civilization, I often wonder what the 30th century archaeologists would find. Would it be the miles upon miles of smooth surface pavings and the geometric clover leaves which seemingly lead to nowhere? Is the network of highways of such importance to posterity, say, in the 30th century? Would it be the acres upon acres of tiny bits of metal that they would later find to be nothing more than just jet airplanes? Or would it be these giant temples of steel, brick, and glass soaring hundreds and hundreds of feet into the air? Would these remains be our 20th century temples to God? The Empire State Building, the Chrysler Building, the acres of builders' houses. Would these temples, and they are indeed temples, be expressions of our times on the same plane as we would think of the pyramids of Egypt or Mexico or the Parthenon or Chartres? When any of these magnificent structures have withstood the desperation of time, even when some of these edifices stand in spite of man and not because of man, then by what magical powers do these pieces of architecture live and exist? Is it through some brilliant Madison Avenue ad slogan, some Mother Goose rhyme, or is it rather some timeless quality, intangible to the eye, but giving timeless life to all those who behold its mighty beauty, that is to say, architecture itself? Now, all of this precedes what I would consider to be concept. And just to deviate for a second, let me say that laymen have accused us students, and I do consider myself a student because I hope never to stop learning, of being given a special magical list when we enter as freshmen. And this magical list consists of 2 Barcelona chairs, 1 Mies table, any couch by Florence Knoll, any rug as long as it's gray-brown family, a Bertoia chair, carpeting with no patterns except possibly an oriental rug, lighting by Noguchi, any kind of modern painting provided that there's no recognizable form in this painting to clash with our architecture. And in case our professors forgot to tell us about this magic list, the price for a 2-bedroom apartment is probably about $9,700. This, of course, doesn't include the foreign sports car in our driveway, as we consider that all American designed cars are totally unacceptable. So this already brings the tab to about $17,000. But then as architectural students, we decide that all this charretting and no sleeping and no dating and all these magic markers are getting to us. So we decided we were going to quit architecture. So we go running down to University Avenue here, and we go peddle about $9,700 worth of goodies to some engineering students. And then we start using marvelous words like scale and texture and color and form and concept, and then that 25-cent word called articulation, which at that point the engineering student throws up all over that new shiny Barcelona table, which costs $980 FOB. But if we do have this magic list, and I think we do have this magic list, I think the one unscrutable and perhaps unifying word is concept. This magic 2-syllable word really defines our profession. And perhaps, hopefully, the 2 concepts that we will see tonight in the pyramids of Egypt and the pyramids of Mexico will better give us an understanding of what the term concept means. And if we do understand this, then we might even begrudgingly admit that our professors aren't so bad after all, and they might even know what they're talking about, which is something that's very hard for a student to admit to at times. I know it was hard for me. And could I have the lights, please, for the slides? Why concept? Without any concept of any building, it just becomes merely stones and bricks. And in this, we see the Acropolis in Athens, done in 438 BC. We're in awe of the Acropolis, and that's because we're supposed to be. Everybody tells us it's great. Everybody tells us that it's the greatest piece of architecture that mankind and Western civilization has ever produced. And the question that I'd like to find out during this whole process of seeing it is why and how. And hopefully that when we look at these structures, particularly the mighty Parthenon, that we come to some realization of why. The Parthenon was supposed to be and is the most refined of all our Greek buildings, and it's divided into two rooms. One is called the Goddess's Shrine, and the other smaller room is called the Treasury. And the smaller Treasury building is called Parthenon in Greek, and this is how we get its name. And of course we have the 8 columns in the front and the 17 columns on the side, 17 being the magical number because the Greeks felt that after the number 17 the eye was found it very difficult to perceive. And then the Erechtheion, which was done in 421 with the Ionic columns and the forerunners of Roman buildings to come. Or the Erechtheion with the caryatid porches where the sculptures are replacing the columns itself. Well, we wonder about the concepts of such buildings as the Blue Mosque, which was done in Istanbul in the 8th century. The name being given to Blue Mosque as a result of the blue tiles which are on the inside. And we'll notice that in the Muslim temples we'll always get highly decorative floral and geometric patterns. This is primarily because in the Muslims' laws, which becomes a concept in itself, it forbids iconographic reference to either men or animals. And we look at this Blue Mosque, which has the 6 minarets with the high minarets coming up, where the holy sing out to the worshipers 5 times daily. Or the concept of the Byzantine domes with its pediments and its arches. And the example here is probably second only to San Sofia, which no longer is in existence today as a Muslim worshiping house, but really just as a museum. So it's quite empty, and the result, it doesn't carry on the same feeling as it once had. Oh, we look at the concepts of the ideas of Carcassonne in the medieval period. The problem of encasing and defending a city by walls and battlements and bulwarks become the boulevard for townspeople to walk on. And this wall strengthened by towers giving both structural and defensive forms. Louis Kahn said that through the concept of the forms of Carcassonne would lie his greatest influence in today's contemporary works. And perhaps maybe if we understood Carcassonne better from the conceptual understanding, even though it was done over 1,000 years ago, we could understand better the problems in which Louis Kahn arrived at his solutions. So if such concepts or ideas is of significance, then perhaps in Egypt, where Western man first introduced his imaginative ideas to buildings, we can find some philosophical thoughts in this ancient civilization. To find this architectural concept, that intangible commodity which makes it so and gives meaning to bricks, stones, and mortar. Dorothy Hale Gray has called Egypt the land of sown, sun, and silence. And perhaps this euphonious phrase may be apropos as we visit the pyramids, which is really nothing more than a structure heaped apparently with stones solely for the purpose of housing the dead, and to further place mystery on the eternal question of death and the spirit of the hereafter. Here's the actual model of the pyramids of Giza, which were done about 2723 to 2563 BC during the great period of Egyptian history. The plan and the grouping of the pyramids does, by its austerity and its geometric form and exactness, conceive a memorial to it by its very nature, and it does indeed enshrine a form simple as directly as a tomb as we may think of it today. And so we go from the city of Cairo itself to the tombs, which is out a little bit past into the desert, and we see what it's going to look like. And the native dress of the people today is not really much different than it was about 3,000 years ago, having the galibayas on. And we start to look at the most famous of all the Giza pyramids, which is Cheops' tomb. Cheops' tomb is 481 feet high and 755 feet square. And as we start approaching this pyramid, all we see really is just a form, a simple geometric form, which we now today just simply call a pyramid. And we look at this and we don't really start to realize either scale nor color or texture. We just see a form. We see some color in it because of the bright sun, but we just recognize this very simple form, which is, as we have already know, it's for the dedication of the dead, but it certainly makes very much sense that this is kind of a tombstone idea, and we don't see much of anything else. But as we approach the pyramid closer and closer, we start to notice a little bit more of form. We start to visually see a little bit more pattern, and as we get closer here in this picture, we start to see the Sphinx, the famous Sphinx, which is 65 feet high, which was done about 2530 BC. And as we start to move around the pyramid, we start to see the Sphinx in a greater perspective, but we do start to feel a little bit more as far as scale and the form is concerned. And as we move around it, we start to see, unfortunately, the nose that was shot off by Napoleon back in his good old days, which he used for target practice. And we can't blame Napoleon too much, I guess, because at least he did one good thing. If nothing else, he brought back the Rosetta Stone, which really was the key in deciphering the Egyptian hieroglyphics and also the cartouches, which we'll see later. Moving around the pyramid again. Now, as we start to get a little closer, we start to see more than one form. In fact, the pyramids is really three major pyramids. And within these three major pyramids, there are three minor pyramids. And this happens to two of them. And Cheops being the only one pyramid that does not have any satellites. But we still have not sensed a scale. All we start to do is, on the left-hand side, you can start to see that there is stonework. You start to notice the size of this building. And then here is the three minor pyramids along the major one, and we start to see a little bit more of the texture. So first we saw nothing more than form, then we started to see a little bit more in color, and now we're starting to see a little bit more in scale. And we start to notice the outlines and how it feels, but we still don't see scale in terms of man in scale, but scale within each other. And then we finally see that there are ridges to this magnificent structure. And it becomes very recognizable as we get closer to the tomb because we start to sense man scale. That's because there's an image of columns and then there is an image of sculpture. So we see within these this great lesson as we approach closer and closer to it, we start attuning ourselves to the real sense of scale. Until finally we see how really fantastically large this structure is. It appears 481 feet high, but against a background of just pure sky, it's much higher. And you can see from the scale, and this is where my wife is holding up her hands there, the stones are about 3.5 meters high, which is almost 5 feet at some places. They're about 5 to 6 feet across and 8 feet deep. And to be able to walk up this pyramid is really quite a fantastic feat. And you can see from the scale of the boy on the donkey, that's this fantastically tremendous scale. And as this straight vertical shot, and of course if you walk up these fantastic pyramids, you always have to have a Coca-Cola when you walk down, and the Egyptians have provided for that very nicely. These are the step pyramids at Saqqara, and the step pyramids is a derivative of the mastaba, and this is really for structural reasons and not for religious reasons as it is in Mexico. But again, you can see that this fantastic premonition for trying to develop a monument for the dead was solely as a singular monument, one single form which could represent the hereafter. And here, of course, is a night shot of the pyramid showing its concept. And you can, even if we never knew that this was for somebody dead, we could just kind of feel this aura. And so the whole simple concept of housing in a simple, direct way, this concept of eternity, of monumentality, and grandeur for a tomb. And I think very well it expresses in architectural terms the whole sensation. And I think perhaps we can get even more of a sensation as we start going down the Nile, and I start showing you some of the slides of Luxor and of Karnak. And so we start to leave the concept bound by the desert, and we start to go into Karnak. This is the temple of Karnak at Ammon. And this was done about 1530 to 323 BC. So we're talking about just a little bit before Christ. And the site was about 1,200 feet by 360 feet. And of course, we know that they had highly developed the post and lintel system, but not much of anything else as far as arches are concerned. And there's a strong axial plan to the temples at Karnak, and it almost gives a funereal flavor even from this shot here, which is on the outside, really. And so we see here an aerial view of the cult temple consisting of pylons and hypostyles and sanctuaries. And these buildings were used for public worship, and they were used for prayers and congregations for themselves and also for the dead. Nobody was actually buried here as such, but there certainly was a tremendous affinity towards the congregation worshiping for the dead later on. And this is very similar to what we would consider the churches of today, and the spacing of light and shadow. Here we see the first use of clear-story light, and something that we forget, that it was the Egyptians 4,000 years ago that first came out with the clear-story light, which you can see up on top, the 3 central aisles through the grilled windows, and this allowed for not only light to come into the temple, but also allowed for the roofing structure to allow some of the hot air and gases to escape into the very, very hot and penetrable Egyptian sun. These are the obelisks, and amazing enough, all of these obelisks are carved out of one singular piece of marble, as well as we know that the pyramids, for all its greatness, certainly produced a lot of hernias in those days. This particular obelisk exceeded 120 feet high, and it's carved out of one single piece of marble, which they also dragged from the Cairo, Lebanon area all the way down the Nile. So we're talking about a distance of over about 800 miles floating down the Nile. This is the giant papyrus column at the Temple of Ptah, and it's very elegant, and yet it's tremendously refined. And we'll not really know the scale of this column again until I show you a later shot with my wife again for scales. You know, wives are very handy things for scales if you want an excuse for the income tax people. I'm sorry, Caroline. But you can see here the ultimate refinement of it. Here is the giant statues and colossus of Ramses II, and guarding the passageways, again, this tremendous monumentality of trying to take the living into a grandeur eventually for the dead. And showing the background falling on the right-hand side, you can see the statue of Ramses II. The statue is about 50 feet high originally. Unfortunately, in this part of Egypt, which is the what they call the Upper Nile, around where the Aswan Dam is, not many tourists go down there, and the result is that the Egyptian government has not seen fit to really take care of some of these monuments. It's in rather poor condition, and you can do almost anything there, and we'll later even show you a mummy that my wife and I just happened to come across. These are the great columns at the Temple of Ramses III, and that's about 1198 BC. The 8 papyrus stems which continue upward into a capital, and the later being both the shaft and the capital were made smooth, and this is the first leanings towards the early Greek columns, which we can show you later. And here's a detail of the columns and the richly carved cartouches, even to the point where underneath the lintel you see these cartouches. And these cartouches are carvings which are negative carvings, and this is so that the sun can really hit them and you can see them, are really stories venerating the dead and going to the world beyond, and the story of how this man lived. So we see here in the Temple of Karnak the sensation of form and the sun and light, shadow and darkness, and all of this kind of vanishing into the horizon, so to speak. And here is the carved limestone marble. And some architectural historians say that the Egyptians not only suffered from a lot of hernias, but also suffered death by giganticism. But I think that a column detail such as this, with the proportions, and the first time that emphasis was really used in scale, I think would make that statement very unfounded to me, because I think I found a tremendously high civilization in Egypt. In some respects, I think even higher than the Greeks. This is a sculptural detail from Deir el-Bahariya, and this is from the temple of Queen Hatshepsut in 1520. The uses of detail and friezes, and these columns, there were originally 134 of them, 16 in a row. So if anybody think that they weren't very clever in coming up with some of these structural feats, they certainly were. Here's a building that I found in structural form and concept, perhaps even competing with the forms of Louis Kahn today. I was rather amazed at seeing this, and this was just happened to be a side building. This was not a religious building. It probably housed some officials at one time. As you can see, even 4,000 years ago, comparatively, that the form, the scale, the textures, it certainly reminds me of something that Louis Kahn, I really thought, might even enjoy seeing this. And here are some of the low reliefs, or the cartouches, which are stories venerating the dead. And this is from the temple of Cephos, the first, which is about 1312 BC. And you can see here really the negative carvings, so that the sun could show up as it struck in the right way. And this is the animal processions of the pageantry. Again, always this pageantry going on in these highly floral and decorative costumes and light. And we have to remember that all of this architecture which we see today was much, much more colorful. This, as you probably know from your Professor Hermanstein, that all of these structures were highly colored, and perhaps because of the thick paint and the stucco which was often on this thing, over the years this has worn out, but has allowed us to preserve some of the structures and the forms, because it was all this paint that wore off. So it was very, very colorful, almost garish, as a matter of fact. This is the human sculptural form, which is smoothed over very much by time and the weathering, but a lot of these things were very well preserved. As you know, the Dead Sea Scrolls, which Kiesler did a museum for in the other side of Jerusalem, were on papyrus leaves, not leaves, but parchment, and they think that they're about 2,000–3,000 years old. And this is the great Colossus representing one of the dead pharaohs. Now we start to approach another tomb. This is the tomb of Queen Hatshepsut, and this is, as I said, 1520 BC, and it's in the Valley of the Queens, which is near Luxor. And we see again this rhythmical feeling of veneration carved out into this landscape as a tomb for the dead. Unlike the original pyramids, which were a simple form to the dead, this became much more of a living monument, and the concept of Queen Hatshepsut's grave, I would suspect, would be a little bit more attuned to what we would consider in contemporary days in the tomb of Lincoln's Memorial, or the memorial of Taj Mahal. And here's a closer view. As we get closer, we see the perfect symmetry and the form and the grace and the elegance, which is really, this is the first real period in which the Greeks start to take it, their columns into And here you can see some of these columns and these shafts. And here you can see the capital, the shaft, and the base itself. And you can see that how this very easily then got into the Doric order, which was in Greece, as you know. And finally, we go into the Valley of the Kings. It's probably the most sacred burial grounds of all of Egypt. And these sacred burial grounds were so sacred that there was a curse generally put on any of the grave robbers and to anybody else that wanted to be buried there that was not of noble blood. And here, as I said, Carol Ann and I happened to just discover this mummy, and we suspect that this mummy was probably a commoner, which was secretly buried by relatives to be closer to the gods. And the pharaohs were considered gods by the people, and perhaps by being buried in this Valley of the Kings, they would be forever enshrined in the presence of good fortune. Down here is the burial place of one of the dead kings. In fact, this is the only burial chamber that is still in existence in the Valley of the Kings. The rest of them are all either in England or the museum in Metropolitan Museum in New York, or scattered throughout. The poor Egyptians don't have very much, just like I think 3/4 of the Parthenon is really at the London Museum. And it depicts the story of the dead and the good fortunes, and to keep away all the evil spirits. To get an idea of what the costumes must have looked like in those days, one of the burial chambers did have this costume of the guard captain, and this is all in 24-karat gold, and it expresses very much the days that the man looked like, both in size as well as costume, of course. And going back to Colossus size again, here's a picture of my wife in scale again, and this column is over 85 feet high. So I think perhaps as the form of concept is concerned, we see similarities in other people, but we see them not in pure concept, but perhaps just form. And these are the works of Antonio Gaudí in Barcelona, which was done about the early 19th century. And this is an example of Gruel Park. And this is the entrance house. So we see in Gaudí's arched columns and the spindles that he may have been thinking about the final product of some of the Egyptian columns as an architectural solution, but the concepts were very, very different, and that's something I don't think any of us should ever be fooled about. And here we see the gnawing and the growing twisted forms of Gaudí in, again, Gruel Park. And some of the organic patterns of the Art Nouveau era. And of course, they've often said that Gaudí was the granddaddy of Art Nouveau, and they say that the term gaudy came from Gaudí. But I think it's a very unkind thing to say to poor Antonio. Some of the mosaics and the blending, again, the solution seems apparent superficially to the Egyptians, but it isn't at all. This is just a solution which has nothing to do with the same conceptual basis. And some of the broken tiles which Gaudí used, all he did was just take some bathroom tiles and old ceramic tiles and just clip them and just put them together. I think the trees must have known what Gaudí wanted to do, because even the trees seem to grow in the same manner in which Gaudí wanted his columns to. And it's a rather interesting shot. So I really feel that it's the forms may seemingly dictate the architecture, but it's really quite the opposite. It's the concept which dictates the form. And perhaps this is the greatest lesson we can learn from the very simple pyramids which are for the dead. And this is a very important point, that they were for the dead. They were a monumentality, and they were a simple and elegant and perhaps gigantic way of doing it. So whether it's the Egyptian form or a religious form, or columns or animals or the sphinxes, if it's the architectural concept which makes it so, and is in truth and in fact, then we can possibly call ourselves architecture in using it in today's concepts of architecture. Just for a second, I just wanted to continue on, and let's see what Egypt and Cairo of today looks like, and let's see if there has been any effects from this great civilization. We can say that, all right, that this is a completely different group of people, but what effect does architecture have on even a totally unrelated group and civilization? And I think it was rather interesting to see this. They came across with mosques and minarets, and this is a mosque which was done in 1436, the Muhammad Al Mosque, and we can start to see here some of the battens, the walls, and some of the textures, which has some feeling. It's certainly very much in the area. I certainly wouldn't see this in New York City or any other area. And this is where the Muslims must wash their hands and face as a result of Muslims' laws before they enter the mosque. This is a kiosk. The colonnades and the courtyards of the Ali Mosque in Cairo, and it brings forth, I think, some of the feelings of light, shadows, and spaces which the Egyptians were trying to achieve very, very much. And this is the minaret of the Muhammad Ali Mosque. I say the caller climbs all the way to the top of that minaret, and depending on how important the holy day is, he'd either be on the first or the second tier, and he'd be singing. So it's quite romantic, I think, as a tourist, to 5 times a day hear all these callers all singing and chanting at the same time. Kind of like out of a Humphrey Bogart movie come to life. And this is the people of Cairo today, and they seem rather sullen. And I'm not convinced it's because of economy, because even some of the areas where they were lucky enough to be a little wealthy, they still had this very solemn type of atmosphere prevailing. And this marketplace, as it is right now, is unchanged since the days of Christ. And this is over 2,000 years ago, and I have no reason to dispute them, but this is exactly the way that it did look when Christ was in that area. Even the agricultural is the same. The man is lifting water from the Nile River, this muddy water that you see right down here, and he's physically lifting it up to the ditch on the top, and he has a weight, and it's rather hard to believe this next statement, but this is exactly the way they did it 4,000 years ago. The same method, they haven't changed a bit. So one wonders if perhaps the imposing structures of the pyramids and the civilization as such hasn't carried out in some way or the other, and one has to assess the value judgment that as architects, as we are a reflection in building of today's society, no matter what the society is, perhaps the greater responsibility that we have must be done with perhaps a little bit more honesty and integrity. And by contrast, we're going to go into Mexico now. And by contrast, we certainly have the warm tropical climate. We have a great deal of water. We have a very serious rainy season there, practically a monsoon during the late summer months. And here we see a mural depicted by Rivera. This is the entrance to Diego Rivera's museum and murals in Mexico City, and it shows the conquest of Cortez over the Aztecs in Montezuma back in the 14th century. Here it is here. This colorful, bright colors. Now, this is quite contrasting, the warm climate, the brightness, and almost the gaiety and the spontaneity that you see in this mural, as opposed to the marketplace and the dead. There's always this very somber atmosphere, and conceptually, as I said, that this tomb certainly overshadowed all this. And the dress of the Aztecs were really not unlike the natives here. They say this is one of the costumes that were very prevalent in that time. And here they're doing a little dance for the local population. Very colorful feathers and dress, and almost looks like they're ready to go into some kind of a real pageantry. So here we start to look at the pyramids of Mexico. These particular pyramids that we're going to look at are right outside of Mexico City, and they're the pyramids of Teotihuacan. And they were built by the Toltecs and followed by the Aztecs. And they were started in the 12th century and finished in 1325 AD. And they were conquered, as you know, the Aztecs by Hernan Cortez in 1519 with only 400 Spaniards. And that's because they believed Cortez to be some wonderful legendary god. But really, as you all know, he was really a pretty dirty rascal. And we see here at the top the Pyramid of the Moon. And on the right-hand side, the larger structure, we see the Pyramid of the Sun. And it's rather interesting that this is the only structure in North America done that is completely orientated true north. Now, you see a point here which is magnetic north, but this is the only structure true north. The pyramids of Chichen Itza and some of the other pyramids were not orientated exactly true, but this was. The Pyramid of the Sun was the most important only in the point of sacrifices, but the Pyramid of the Moon, which is at the upper top, were the most important as far as the calendar year was concerned. And the pyramid measures of the Sun, which is the largest one, measures 750 feet by 750 feet, which is approximately the same as the pyramids of Egypt, but it only stands 216 feet high, which is about half the height of the pyramids in Egypt. And it was originally 4 miles long and 2 miles wide. And the original city, and this was a city complex, this just happened to be the religious portion of that city, was 160 square meters. And as you know, it's about 40 inches in a meter, or say about a little over 3 feet. So it's really tremendously large complex. And this is really a sensation of spaces. And this civilization started as from the Aztecs, and it was really not to commemorate the dead, but really to be visually seen as a symbol for dying. It's the glory of dying. And in this respect, it's a little bit offensive to us and very unthinkable. But certainly during those times, they had to play up every single movement, a sequential going through of spaces to heighten one's perceptibility to want to be sacrificed. And we're talking about human sacrifices now. And it displays a pageantry setting that I certainly think that Hollywood could take some lessons for. It's exalting the act of taking death, and the short-lived actor, unfortunately, had to be sensed into a mood to accept his fate into a greater and somewhat dubious end. And this dubious end was always very final and very ultimate, and it was unfortunately found out that at some times they sacrificed as many as 30,000 human lives in one day. 30,000. And so in order to do this, we have to set up an architectural mood and a concept which makes the offering climactic and very important. And as you go through this, you can just imagine yourself walking through this tremendous 4-mile stretch and having all eyes upon you with these pyramids around. And then as you walk closer and closer to the pyramids, you start to see the sensation of plateaus. Instead of a singular form, you start to see levels. Then you very noticeably see the stairs. And then you start and you see a small altar first where you're being placed with garlands and wreaths and flowers. And then you walk up this fantastically straight stair And as you go up there, you go up in a group, and it's a singular, and then you branch off into two smaller stairs, one on each side, flanking almost into a very much of a ritual feeling. And then as you go up higher and higher, you start to feel more and more important, and you just feel like that you're the most important person in the world. And you can just imagine yourself going down this procession, this last mile, so to speak, and the splendid drums beating, and then the architectural setting as it faces. We are now, at this particular point, facing the pyramid of the moon and the smaller pyramids below. And we start to walk around these visual spaces, of which there were on every step placed men of importance with regal garments, kind of just egging you on, you know, just rooting for you, so to speak, to make it to the top, so you get your guts cut out. You know, it's a terrific concept they had. But it did finally work, because they went up there. And you start to walk around these sensations. Now, if you were not a very important person, and everybody wanted to be important, I think we even do today, you got slaughtered on these smaller pyramids. But you got slaughtered nevertheless. And go around the sensation again of the pyramids. You can see this very geometric pattern, this syncopated mood. You can almost feel as if Hitler would have done very well here. Even to the point of the architecture articulation around the sides. Now, we have to realize that these lava stones and these little tiny stones in between, this was not the way it was originally, just like the pyramids were not. What they did is they filled in between the mortar these little tiny stones, and this was then all later stuccoed and very, very highly colored with animals and with decorations and floral wreaths, and you know, it was really a MGM setting. They really got you in the mood to take that bitter pill. Of course, they also doped you up a little bit, and this is probably where the saying is they really probably were very potted. He was climbing up on one of these smaller pyramids. And again, you start to see how this ascent, you feel very important going up there. Look at that, those two figures up on top, how very striking they look. And so the architectural is played down, even though the fantastic height is up there. And of course, they had this tremendous height because they felt that the higher up they were to the heavens, the closer they were to the gods, and therefore they would be received in better order. But certainly it's not scaleless as it is in the pyramids. You start to sense scale it for another reason, because they start to cut plateaus. That's the first thing that they did. The second thing they did was to make you feel important by putting strategically the stairs as they are. It certainly would have been very easy to take the stairs just straight up, but they were clever enough to start with the plateau, two side stairs, as you see on both flanking, and then the great middle stairs, and then two smaller ones. As I say, you just proceed up, and this made you feel better and better, supposedly. And here is a view from the pyramid of the sun looking down, and you can just imagine again the whole feeling, this aura of wanting to, of going to meet your maker. And it was always the strongest and the boldest and the best that made it. They never wanted to offer to the god somebody that was a weakling. So this is a good time for all of us to puncture our eardrums, because you were unacceptable. And the result was that by the time that Cortez had come around to Mexico at this time, all the strong ones had been killed off, so to speak. So there were just a bunch of weak nincompoops running around that were ready to accept this great white man that came around. And here's a view from the Temple of the Moon looking down the other way, and you can see some of the pyramids have been destroyed, the smaller pyramids, but this was 4 miles long, and you walk through this 4-mile procession with the music and the banner and the flowers, and it almost wants to, you almost like to see it again. It's so dramatic. But this is purely an architectural solution based on a bad concept, but certainly a concept nevertheless, which set up this importance, and probably is nothing more final than death, so that if for no other reason, we have to admit that they were extremely successful through their architecture. These are some of the recent discovery near Teotihuacan, and these are the temples which are done way before it. Now, as in all civilizations, you will find people that build on top of others. One reason that the Roman Forum, the Colosseum, is in such great ruins is that half of the marbles and stones were used to build another monument, and this, of course, went on and on. In these days, the same thing happened. So this is a discovery made within the last 50 years, I believe, outside of Teotihuacan, and this is the temple of Quetzalcoatl. And this is probably pre-Mayan. And you can see from the garish figures and the influences how they really do believe that somehow a long time ago the Asiatics may have come in through Alaska, down the coast of California, and then settled here, because many of these forms and animals are very much related to the older Chinese and Japanese figures and figurines and sculpture. And here they are again, the animals. You can almost see the great Chinese food dogs and representations to it. Very highly sophisticated, and these were, again, you can see some remnants of color in some of these slides, but they were highly, highly colored in those days. In all probability, these temples were also used for human sacrifices, which they believed were very good in those days. Now we go to some of the round pyramids, another form for presenting the same basic thought, which was pyramids dedicated to the establishment of taking human sacrifices for the gods. These are pyramids that are outside of Toluca. These are very ancient pyramids, much, much older than the pyramids of Teotihuacan and not nearly as sophisticated, but again, pyramids which were designed in to make the person feel the importance of the silhouette stood out, so to speak. This was probably done about 900 AD. And the rear of this is where the wooden steps or the stone steps probably were, and this is how they climbed the steps up to the altarpiece. And this is the rear view of it. Now, continue on the same thesis as we used in Egypt and seeing what is contemporary, what was contemporary Egypt like. We're going to see what contemporary Mexico is like today. And just for the fun of it, just not being archaeologists, but just as architects, just kind of rambling on as a thought, what have these pyramids produced, because they are so close to Mexico City, just as the pyramids of Egypt are very close in Giza, are very close to Cairo. How does this translate in contemporary society today? And this is the Shrine of Guadalupe, which is for religious Catholic religious. The dedications of the Mexicans are so deeply embedded that they will walk from their knees at the very beginning of this church all the way to the church. And if any of you doubt how much that really can hurt, I suggest that you try just walking on your knees on smooth floor just from this end of the podium to the other end. It's really quite a dedication and a real deep belief that would make one do this. And this is a typical Chirigaresque church, which is in Mexico City, with the highly ornamental carvings. And this Chirigaresque form is not found in Spain, which is, of course, how Mexico got its greatest influence after Cortez conquered it. But this is strictly from the, I believe, the sculpture and the feelings of some of the pyramids. This is a Chirigaresque church. And this is the famous church which is in Tasco, which is the old city famous for its silver mines. And again, you see the Chirigaresque, although Spanish in some feeling, and yet very much Mexico in its own context. And the interior, which is very richly adorned in gold. Campanile. And I'm contrasting the very solemn faces that we saw in the bazaars of Cairo with this gaiety in Ochimilto, where people are just playing and just seem to have just a tremendously gay time. And here's the floating gardens in the boats, which is also in Ochimilto, of just floating around and just having a very delightful Sunday afternoon. And this isn't a tourist trap by any means. This is for the local population. As you can see, these are local people. Certainly, certain times of year is a great many tourists, but this is their everyday fun, just like when you saw that slide of the bazaar in Cairo. This is not where the tourist would go out and buy his hamburger by any means. This is the mariachi bands going through. And again, you see, this just the whole lightheartedness and the bright colors, even in this very dismal day. It just seems very gay and light and airy. And the very highly decorative architecture of the 1800s in Spain. And this is the Sanborn House in Mexico City, which is kind of he was the man that founded Chase and Sanborn Coffee. In the City Hall in Mexico City, with the proverbial Coca-Cola sign again. They know a good thing when they see it. And this is a kind of a atypical middle income housing, residence rather, for a person living there. And here's some of the light of the interior courts that are in Mexico. There's just fantastically number of interior courts because of the hot sun during the summer times. And this is the cathedral in Mexico City, again displaying perhaps the great religious belief that they have. And so perhaps the concept and religion is perhaps synonymous in this one particular type of structure in the interior of the church. In an old Spanish church, again in Cuernavaca, Churrigueresque in style. And these little niches were made for offerings for when the peasants were felt that God had been very favorable to them. They'd make some type of an offering which they would hang from these little niches and friezes. And even this, which is the community water center, was very richly adorned in some fashion. Again, they made a big ritual out of it as compared with some of the little fountains that you would see in Spain, which would just be a little tiny fountain with some potted trees and flowers around it. But this became a very monumental type experience as you went through it. And very gigantic in scale, really. Here's a monument which is very large and expresses certainly modern day Mexico, but one has to think about in terms of why they did such a monument as this. Not the statue, but the pylon, really. And here is the cultural center, which is the Bellas de Artes, which is one of the few things which is a carryover from Europe. The reminiscence of this is probably the Opera House in Paris. This is an example of Mayan architecture taken from one of the ruins of Chichen Itza, which is really closer to Guatemala than it is Mexico City itself. So I'm just wondering now, as we go and see the National Museum in Mexico, which was just opened up last year, if perhaps as the architect in contemporary Mexico today look back into the history and the past civilizations, what type of a concept he felt would express the great heritage and traditions of his past. And perhaps he did it by this great focal point, which is an inverted pyramid held together by one column. And as one looks at it, it's not only the gigantic form and the scale and keeping the column as slender as possible, but perhaps the twist in that structurally where the greatest moment is coming together, which is the center of the column, instead of strengthening this area, he completely reverses his whole structural system, and he opens it up and lets a waterfall comes through, which projects in one's mind, how does this column hold up? Maybe that's the whole secret of it, the great mystery of what has happened in the pyramids of Teotihuacan, which are now gone forever. And so he's trying to maybe perhaps express in this one focal point this column, which is really structurally doesn't really work the way it should, but it certainly does leave one's imagination open to what has happened in the past. And here we see the student library building at the University of Mexico, with the famous murals depicting not only the history of the revolution, but also the history of Mexico from its former days of Cortez. And this is the murals by Orozco, and with the Mexican onyx windows on the side. And this particular student office building, Union Building also, you'll notice on the right-hand side the onyx material. And this onyx material is the material that after Gordon Bunshaft had visited Mexico City, translated it into his Yale University Rare Books Library. Not particularly the concept of the building, but the concept of just the material itself. And the Rare Books Library in Yale, as you go in, you get this tremendous ethereal feeling as it comes through the onyx. Or perhaps the sports arena with the murals by Diego Rivera, the very simplicity of it, and the stonework and the patterns and the feeling, with its great sports arena, which is going to be used for the Olympics. Or even possibly a very simple bridge, and this is just an average bridge in Mexico linking perhaps somehow with the past, with today and the future, that the pattern of the stones and the articulation of in between. Or even possibly an office building in Mexico City, which is really a fantastically different type of a structure, and perhaps conceptually only possible in Mexico. I'm not really sure. But this is a rather interesting building, and maybe the John Hancock building got some lessons from here too. Something to certainly think about. And so, if concept being an architectural idea and not just purely a form, we can even look at this exhibit in Expo 67 of Man and His World. And in this particular case, the pyramid type form was twisted into a pattern of interior lacy wood. And perhaps this depicts man's open hopes, his dreams, and his fulfillment of rising to the summit of all things. Or possibly the form and the concepts that had Moshe Safdie's habitat with his stacked housing. Or Bucky Fuller's geodesic dome, the American Pavilion, which certainly has a light, spacey atmosphere, both interior and exterior, showing a concept truthfully and carefully fulfilled, both interior and exterior. Or even the light canvas tent of the German Pavilion, also at Expo 67. You know, the great conceptual truth in arriving at such a solution. Or the massing of the New York City's Whitney Museum, designed by Marcel Breuer. I don't think this building really could fit anyplace else except on 75th Street and Madison Avenue in New York. This is a pure statement of a simple concept brought about into a reality by a very great architect. I think I'm missing one slide. There it is. And finally, the airy and delicate pavilion of the United States World's Fair, the United States Pavilion at the World's Fair in Brussels in 1958 by Edward Durrell Stone. His concept for a World's Fair being very light and gay and funful, and something that a fair probably should be. May I have the lights, please, for a second? So perhaps instead of competing for the architectural's year of the year of Kahn, you know, we pick up these architectural magazines and all of a sudden it's the year of Kahn, and next year it's the year of Rudolph or the year of Yamasaki or Sarin or Stone. Let's find solutions within these problems as directly related to architectural and its concepts. We architects are generally intuitive rather than deductive, and therein turn our forms inside out, outside up, inside out, and round side out, just to be different. Not good, but just to be different. The late American genius, architect Frank Lloyd Wright, has a Buddha in his home which bears this inscription translated from the Chinese, and I quote, "Except to an ignoramus or intellectualist, nothing imitative can equal that which is imitated. Instead of imitating effects, search for that principle which made them original and own your own effects." To me personally, end of quote. To me personally, it matters not what buildings are of my design. I can say this really because nobody really cares, but seriously, who here can name who designed the Parthenon or St. Mark's in Venice or even the Taj Mahal? I'm not really sure that it matters. What does matter is that they were done with a greater love and concept, with the conviction that the quality is in all the details and for all the times. Thank you.